Emma and Kyle stood at the edge of their campsite, gazing out at the vast expanse of the Appalachian Trail. The golden hues of sunrise filtered through the dense canopy above, painting the forest floor in streaks of light and shadow. For Emma, a nature photographer, the scene was perfection. For Kyle, an avid outdoorsman, it was freedom. "This is the kind of day that makes it all worth it," Emma said, adjusting her camera strap. Kyle nodded, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Trail map, water, snacks, and our trusty legs. What could go wrong?" The plan was simple. A day hike along a looped trail that would bring them back to camp by mid-afternoon. They'd leave their tent, gear, and campfire ring behind for a few hours to explore the deeper parts of the forest. Kyle carried a revolver, a precaution against bears or other wildlife, though he'd never had to use it. The trail was stunning, weaving through towering trees, past glistening streams, and over moss-covered boulders. Emma frequently stopped to snap photos, each shutter click capturing the untouched beauty of the wilderness. The couple laughed and talked, their voices the only sounds breaking the serene stillness. As they walked, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The birdsong faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. Kyle noticed the shift first, though he didn't mention it. Emma was engrossed in framing a photo of an old, gnarled tree whose bark twisted into almost human-like shapes. "Check this out," she said, beckoning him over. Kyle stepped closer, examining the deep grooves in the bark. The patterns looked intentional, almost like runes or symbols. "Probably just weathering," he said, though something about it unsettled him. "Let's keep moving. We've got a loop to finish." As they continued, the trail seemed to narrow. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining above like skeletal fingers. Emma glanced back, her smile faltering. The path behind them looked different. She shook off the feeling, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. Kyle, ever the pragmatist, took mental notes of their surroundings. The landmark he'd been counting on, a massive boulder covered in ivy, was nowhere in sight, despite it being a central marker on the map. He stopped, frowning. "This doesn't feel right," he admitted. "We should have hit the boulder by now." Emma pulled out her phone to check the GPS, but the screen showed nothing but a spinning loading icon. "No signal," she said. Kyle's jaw tightened. "It's fine. We probably just missed the turn. We'll backtrack." But as they retraced their steps, nothing looked familiar. The gnarled tree Emma had photographed was gone, replaced by a cluster of identical pines. The forest seemed to close in around them, each step pulling them deeper into the unknown. Emma and Kyle exchanged uneasy glances. What had started as a carefree hike now felt heavy, the forest oppressive. Without landmarks or a working GPS, the trail stretched endlessly ahead, no longer a friendly path but a labyrinth. And still the birdsong did not return. Kyle glanced at his watch. Nearly 2 hours had passed since they started backtracking. Sweat clung to his brow despite the cool air, and Emma's normally bright expression had dimmed with worry. "We've been walking in circles," Emma muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "This can't be right." Kyle tried to sound confident, but his words faltered. "Maybe the forest just looks the same everywhere. We'll find the right path soon." Emma didn't respond, instead scanning the trees. They were all tall, their trunks smooth and uniform, their tops vanishing into a canopy that let in almost no sunlight now. The forest seemed darker than it had just an hour ago. Kyle pulled out the map again, unfolding it with a frustrated huff. "It doesn't make sense. This trail isn't even supposed to split." He pointed at the sheet, tracing a finger along the clear loop marked in red. "See, we're supposed to loop back to camp." Emma leaned in, but the map might as well have been written in another language for all the good it did them now. The trail they were on wasn't marked. The forest didn't care for red lines or carefully drawn paths. "I don't think we're on the trail anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "We must have wandered off without realizing." Kyle wanted to argue but couldn't. Deep down he knew she was right. He folded the map and shoved it into his pack. "Okay. New plan. We keep walking in one direction. The forest has to end somewhere. Worst case, we hit a road or another trail." Emma nodded, though her face betrayed little confidence. She adjusted her camera strap, the lens swinging like a pendulum with every step as they trudged forward. The forest seemed to shift with them. No matter how far they walked, the trees remained dense, the air thick. Time lost meaning. The sun was still above the horizon, but its light grew faint, as though it had given up trying to pierce the canopy. Kyle noticed other changes, too. The ground beneath their boots felt soft, almost spongy, and the air carried a faint, earthy smell that he couldn't place. He paused to catch his breath, hands on his hips, scanning the surroundings. That's when Emma saw it, a symbol carved into the bark of a tree just ahead. It was small, about the size of her palm, and intricately detailed. She stepped closer, her fingers hovering over the grooves. "What is that?" Kyle asked, joining her. The symbol wasn't like anything he'd seen before, not a letter or number, but a strange combination of geometric shapes and curved lines. It looked ancient, like it had been there long before the forest itself. "I don't know," Emma replied, backing away. "It feels wrong." Kyle examined it for a moment longer before shaking his head. "Just some kid's idea of a prank. Let's keep moving." But as they walked on, more symbols appeared. Each tree seemed to bear a mark, all different but clearly connected. They weren't random. Kyle's pace quickened. Emma struggled to keep up, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Her heart pounded, and though she tried to focus on the path ahead, an undeniable feeling gnawed at her, a sense of being watched. The forest no longer felt indifferent. It felt alive, and it didn't want them to leave. The symbols grew more frequent, appearing on nearly every tree they passed. Each one seemed more intricate than the last, with strange patterns looping and intersecting in ways that defied logic. Emma took a photo of one, but the digital display on her camera showed only a blur where the carving should have been. "It didn't even focus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's weird." Kyle glanced at the camera, then back at the tree. Maybe the light's messing with it. But Emma wasn't convinced. Her camera had captured countless photos in worse lighting conditions, yet now it refused to focus on these markings. It was as though the symbols themselves rejected being recorded. They pressed on, the tension between them palpable. Neither spoke much now, each lost in their own uneasy thoughts. The forest seemed to be closing in around them. The trees leaned closer together, their branches interlocking above to form a nearly impenetrable canopy. The light dimmed further, casting the forest floor in an oppressive twilight. Kyle stopped abruptly, causing Emma to nearly bump into him. "Hold on," he said, crouching to the ground. A pile of smooth stones lay in the center of the trail, carefully stacked into a small cairn. "Someone's been here," he said. "This is a trail marker." Emma crouched beside him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "That's good, right? It means we're not the only ones lost out here." "Maybe," Kyle said, but his tone was hesitant. Something about the cairn felt off. It wasn't just the way the stones were stacked, but the precision of it. The stones were impossibly clean, free of moss or dirt, as though they'd been placed only moments ago. Emma reached out to touch it, but Kyle grabbed her wrist. "Don't. We don't know who put it there or why." She pulled her hand back, nodding reluctantly. "You're right, let's just keep moving." As they walked, more cairns appeared, each one positioned at the edge of the trail. They varied in size, some only a few stones high, others towering at knee level. The symbols on the trees began to change, too. They were sharper now, more jagged, and seemed to grow larger the deeper they ventured. Emma noticed something else. The trail wasn't just unfamiliar, it was inconsistent. At times it was wide enough for them to walk side by side. Other times it narrowed to barely more than a footpath. The ground itself shifted, patches of dirt giving way to loose gravel, then soft moss, then back again. "It's like the trail doesn't want us to know where we're going," she muttered under her breath. Kyle gripped the revolver at his side, his knuckles white. He didn't share her observation, but he felt it too. The path was no longer a path. It was a maze, twisting and turning with no logic or reason. A branch snapped in the distance, breaking the heavy silence. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Kyle's hand instinctively moved to the revolver, his finger hovering near the trigger. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He scanned the trees, his pulse quickening. Emma stayed close to him, her camera now clutched tightly in her hands. "If it's an animal, it's not afraid of us." Kyle nodded, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he regretted not packing more than just the revolver. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. The forest felt alive, every branch, shadow, and leaf conspiring against them. Kyle kept his revolver drawn, scanning the dense trees for movement. Emma stayed behind him, her breath quick and shallow. The snapping of branches was distant now, but it felt deliberate, like whoever or whatever was making the noise wanted them to notice. The path ahead curved sharply to the right, disappearing into a thicket of trees. Kyle hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But where would they go? The trail behind them was no safer, and they had no clue how to navigate this shifting nightmare. "Stay close," Kyle said, his voice low but firm. They rounded the corner, stepping cautiously. The air here was colder, a damp chill that clung to their skin. Ahead, the path split into two. One fork led deeper into the trees, the other veered toward an open clearing. In the center of the clearing stood something that made Emma's stomach twist. It was a figure, human-shaped, but wrong. It stood perfectly still, its back to them. The figure was tall, draped in what looked like tattered clothing, the fabric hanging in strips, its head tilted slightly to one side as if listening. Kyle raised the revolver, his grip steady but his mind racing. "Don't move," he whispered. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes locked on the figure. "Kyle, what is that?" "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "But we're not going near it." As if hearing his words, the figure turned. Slowly, unnaturally, its head swiveled around before the rest of its body followed. The face, or what should have been a face, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched over a humanoid skull. Emma let out a small gasp, and the thing took a step toward them. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. Kyle aimed the revolver at its chest. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. The creature stopped, tilting its head again. For a moment it seemed to consider him. Then in a horrifying display, its body began to shift. The arms elongated, the legs bent at unnatural angles, and its torso twisted as though its bones were liquid. The blank face contorted, features emerging where none had been, Kyle's nose, Emma's eyes, a grotesque mimicry of the two of them combined. Emma stumbled back, her hands trembling. "Kyle, shoot it now!" Kyle didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, the crack of the revolver shattering the eerie quiet. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a guttural, inhuman sound and darted into the trees with impossible speed. The couple stood frozen, the echoes of the gunshot fading into the distance. Kyle kept the revolver raised, his eyes scanning the forest. "It's still out there," he said, his voice grim. Emma clutched his arm. What was that thing?" Kyle didn't answer. He didn't know. But he did know one thing. They were no longer lost in an ordinary forest. Whatever had been stalking them wasn't human, and it wasn't done with them yet. The forest seemed to close in tighter after the encounter, the trees forming a labyrinth of shadows and towering walls. Every step Emma and Kyle took was measured, the weight of their fear pressing down on them like a physical force. The creature's mimicry haunted them, its grotesque transformation etched into their minds. "We can't just keep wandering," Emma said, her voice trembling. "It's out there, and it's faster than us." Kyle's grip tightened around the revolver. He scanned the woods, every rustle and flicker of movement setting his nerves on edge. "We stick together. If it comes back, I'll put it down for good." Emma nodded, though her faith in his words was limited. Their supplies were running low, and the shifting trail offered no clear direction. The fear of dehydration or starvation gnawed at her, but it paled compared to the terror of the thing hunting them. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood a makeshift hut, its walls constructed from mismatched planks of wood and covered in strips of moss and vines. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked metal pipe poking out of the roof. The sight of it brought Emma to an abrupt halt. "Do you think someone lives here?" she asked, her voice a mix of hope and disbelief. Kyle didn't lower the revolver. "Let's find out." They approached cautiously, the dry leaves crunching beneath their boots. As they neared the entrance, a gruff voice called out from within. "Don't come any closer unless you want a load of buckshot in your chest." Kyle stopped, holding up his free hand. "We're lost. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need help." There was a long silence. Then the door creaked open, revealing an old man with a wild tangle of gray hair and a beard to match. His eyes were sharp and calculating, and he held a shotgun loosely at his side. He stepped out, sizing them up. "You're on cursed land," the man said flatly, his gaze flicking to the revolver in Kyle's hand. "No one comes out here unless they're desperate or stupid." Emma stepped forward. "We didn't mean to. We got lost, and now something is chasing us." The man's face hardened. "You saw it, didn't you? The skinwalker." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Emma and Kyle exchanged uneasy glances. "What is it?" Kyle asked. "And how do we get out of here?" The old man shook his head. "You don't. Not unless it lets you. That thing owns this forest. It's part of the curse, and it's older than any of us. If it's after you, you're as good as dead." Emma's knees wobbled, and she grabbed Kyle's arm for support. "There has to be a way. We can't just die out here." The old man sighed, stepping aside and gesturing for them to enter. "You'd better come inside. If it hasn't gotten you yet, you've still got a chance. But don't get your hopes up." Reluctantly, they followed him into the dark, musty hut. It smelled of damp wood and smoke, with strange charms hanging from the ceiling. The old man shut the door behind them, bolting it with a large iron bar. "The skinwalker doesn't like fire," he said, tossing a log onto the small stove. "It doesn't like iron either, but don't think that'll save you. It's clever, smarter than anything you've ever met. If it's got its sights set on you, it'll find a way." Kyle leaned against the wall, his jaw tight. "So what do we do?" The old man's eyes darkened. "Pray." The dim light inside the hermit's hut flickered as the fire crackled in the iron stove. The warmth was a stark contrast to the cold dread Emma and Kyle felt. The old man moved with purpose, his rough hands sorting through an assortment of jars and trinkets scattered across a rickety wooden table. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, similar to those on the trees, but more intricate, more deliberate. Kyle stood near the door, his revolver still in hand. "You said it's part of a curse. What kind of curse traps people in a forest like this?" The old man glanced up, his sharp eyes narrowing. "The kind that's been here for centuries. This forest is a prison, not just for people, but for things far worse. The skinwalker is just one of them." Emma shuddered, clutching her arms. "Why is it hunting us? We didn't do anything." The man scoffed, tossing a handful of dried herbs into a bowl. "You're in its territory, that's all it needs. It doesn't just kill for food, it kills to keep the curse alive. Every lost soul, every victim feeds it." Kyle's grip tightened on the revolver. "So how do we break it? There has to be a way." The hermit chuckled darkly. "Break it? You think you can outsmart an ancient force? The only reason I'm still alive is because I made a deal, a truce." Emma frowned. "A deal?" The old man hesitated, his eyes flicking to the barred door as if expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. "I don't leave my cabin after dark, and I don't interfere with what it hunts. In return, it leaves me alone. But you two showing up here, that complicates things." Kyle stepped forward, his tone sharp. "What do you mean?" The hermit sighed, running a hand through his tangled beard. "Helping you puts me on its list. It doesn't tolerate broken promises." Emma's face paled. "So what? You're just going to send us back out there?" The man's gaze softened, and for a moment there was a flicker of humanity beneath his gruff exterior. "No, I can't just throw you to it. I'll give you supplies, tell you what I know. But you need to understand. Once you leave this cabin, you're on your own, and it will come for you." He turned back to the table, pulling out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were crude iron spikes and a handful of small jars filled with a black tar-like substance. "These might slow it down. Iron burns it, and this," he held up one of the jars, "is made from herbs it hates. Coat your bullets in it if you want to have a chance." Kyle took the bundle, his expression grim. "What about you?" The hermit gave a bitter laugh. "I'll stay here. If it's going to come for me anyway, at least I'll go down in my home." Emma's eyes welled with tears. "I'm so sorry." The old man waved her off. "Don't waste your pity on me, just focus on surviving." Before they could reply, a low guttural growl echoed through the forest, penetrating even the thick wooden walls of the cabin. The hermit froze, his face ashen. He moved to the stove, dousing the fire with a scoop of dirt. "It knows you're here," he whispered. "You need to go, now." Kyle and Emma hesitated, but the urgency in his voice left no room for argument. They gathered the supplies, Kyle reloading his revolver with the coated bullets. The hermit opened a back hatch leading into the trees. "Follow the stars," he said, his voice strained. "And don't look back, no matter what you hear." Emma started to speak, but the sound of a sharp, animalistic cry from the forest cut her off. The hermit shoved them out, slamming the hatch shut behind them. For a moment, there was silence. Then the air exploded with a terrifying, inhuman scream. Kyle and Emma sprinted through the dense forest, their breaths ragged and uneven. The trees seemed even closer now, their branches clawing at the couple as they pushed forward. The revolver felt heavy in Kyle's hand, and the iron spikes clattered in his pack with every step. The hermit's last words echoed in his mind, "Don't look back." Behind them, the creature's guttural scream tore through the air again, closer this time. Emma stumbled but caught herself, her hands trembling as she clung to Kyle's arm. "We can't just leave him," she cried, her voice shaking. Kyle slowed for a moment, his jaw clenched. "What do you want me to do? He told us to go." Another scream pierced the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. Emma froze, her face pale as she turned toward the direction of the hermit's cabin. "It's there. It's going after him." Kyle grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "There's nothing we can do. He knew the risk." Emma resisted, her eyes brimming with tears. "Kyle, we can't just—" A blood-curdling howl erupted from behind them, silencing her protests. It wasn't just the scream of an animal. It was layered with something human, a twisted mockery of a voice. The sound of crashing wood and guttural growls echoed louder, signaling the chaos unfolding at the cabin. Kyle pulled her forward again, his tone firm. "Emma, if we don't move, we're next." Reluctantly, she followed, her legs trembling with every step. The forest seemed darker now, the moonlight barely cutting through the canopy. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle a threat. But the sounds from the cabin grew fainter with distance, the chaos fading into an eerie silence. Finally, the couple stopped, collapsing onto a patch of mossy ground. Emma buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "We left him to die," she whispered. Kyle sat beside her, his hand still gripping the revolver. He made his choice. He knew what helping us meant. Emma looked up, tears streaking her face. "What if it comes for us next? What if we're leading it right to us?" Kyle's jaw tightened, and he checked the cylinder of the revolver, making sure every coated bullet was ready. "Then we'll be ready." A sudden crack of branches from the direction they had come made them both freeze. Kyle rose to his feet, his revolver aimed toward the sound. The forest fell deathly silent, save for their ragged breathing. "I don't think it's over," Emma said, her voice barely audible. The quiet stretched, oppressive and suffocating, before a new sound broke through. It wasn't the scream of the creature this time. It was a low, wet scraping, like something dragging itself across the forest floor. Emma's face paled. "It's here." Kyle steadied his aim, his muscles tense. The scraping grew louder, punctuated by faint clicking sounds. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. And then it stepped into view. The skinwalker was no longer imitating them. Its body was grotesque, a writhing mass of elongated limbs and shifting shapes. Its face twisted between forms, one moment blank and smooth, the next resembling the hermit's twisted features. Blood dripped from its claws, staining the mossy ground beneath it. Kyle didn't hesitate. He fired once, the shot ringing out and striking the creature in its chest. It recoiled, a hiss escaping its distorted mouth, but it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged forward with horrifying speed. "Run!" Kyle shouted, grabbing Emma and pulling her away. The skinwalker's guttural growl echoed behind them as it gave chase, unrelenting in its pursuit. The forest became a blur of shadows and flickering light as Kyle and Emma sprinted, their boots pounding against the uneven ground. The skinwalker's guttural growls were impossibly close, the sound like nails scraping against stone, sending shivers through their bodies. Kyle pushed Emma ahead, his revolver gripped tightly in his hand. He glanced back and saw the creature moving with an unnatural gait, its twisted limbs jerking as it leaped from tree to tree, closing the distance with terrifying speed. "Keep going," Kyle shouted, firing a shot over his shoulder. The bullet struck the creature in its shoulder, the iron-coated round making it recoil with a shriek. It stumbled, but didn't stop, its twisted form contorting as it adapted to the wound. Emma's breathing was ragged, her legs burning from the effort of running. "We can't outrun it forever," she cried, her voice breaking with panic. Kyle knew she was right. He scanned the dense forest, his mind racing for a plan. Ahead he spotted a cluster of fallen trees and jagged rocks, terrain difficult to navigate, even for something as unnatural as the skinwalker. "This way," he said, pulling Emma toward the debris. They scrambled over the uneven ground, the sharp edges of the rocks cutting into their palms. Kyle turned and fired another shot, the creature dodging with inhuman precision. It let out a guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the forest. As they climbed over the largest fallen tree, Kyle stopped and turned to face the creature. "Go, Emma, keep moving," he ordered, his revolver aimed at the beast. "No, I'm not leaving you," Emma protested, but the look in Kyle's eyes made her hesitate. He was resolute, determined to give her a chance to escape. The skinwalker emerged from the shadows, its form larger and more grotesque than before. Its body seemed to ripple, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it crouched, ready to pounce. Kyle steadied his aim, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come on, you bastard," he muttered, firing 2 quick shots. Both bullets struck true, the creature letting out a shriek as the iron burned its flesh. It faltered, its movements jerky and disjointed, but it didn't fall. Kyle fired again, the last bullet in the chamber hitting the creature square in its chest. The skinwalker howled in pain, collapsing to the ground in a writhing heap. Black ichor oozed from its wounds, sizzling as it hit the forest floor. Emma climbed back over the fallen tree, grabbing Kyle's arm. "Is it dead?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kyle reloaded the revolver with shaking hands, his eyes never leaving the creature's still form. "I don't know. We can't take any chances." Together they backed away, keeping their distance from the creature. It lay motionless, its body twisted and broken. But neither of them dared to turn their back on it. The forest was silent again, the oppressive tension lifting slightly. Kyle grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her along. "Let's go. If it gets back up, I'm not sticking around to find out." They ran, their footsteps echoing through the quiet woods. Behind them, the creature's body remained still, the black ichor pooling beneath it. But as the couple disappeared into the distance, a faint twitch ran through its twisted limbs, its grotesque form beginning to stir once more. Emma and Kyle pushed forward, the forest a disorienting maze of darkness and shifting shadows. Every muscle in their bodies screamed for rest, but they didn't dare stop. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, the weight of fear propelling them onward. Kyle's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. The skinwalker had survived so much already, iron bullets, injuries that would kill anything natural, and it was still pursuing them. He knew their options were running out. "There," Emma shouted, pointing ahead. The faint glow of moonlight revealed a shallow ravine bordered by massive boulders. It wasn't much, but it offered the semblance of cover. Kyle nodded, and they made their way down into the gully, careful to stay low. "We have to make a stand here," Kyle said, his voice strained but resolute. He reached into his pack, pulling out the iron spikes and jars of the tar-like substance the hermit had given them. Emma crouched beside him, her hands trembling as she took one of the jars. "What do we do? Coat these spikes?" Kyle nodded, working quickly to smear the sticky substance onto the spikes and the remaining bullets. "We don't have enough to fight this thing forever. We'll set a trap and force it to come to us." Emma looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, but didn't argue. Together, they arranged the spikes in a loose semicircle around their position, embedding them into the soft earth. The jagged points glinted faintly in the moonlight, creating a makeshift barrier. The forest above the ravine was eerily quiet, the silence pressing down on them like a weight. Emma's hands shook as she smeared the last jar of the tar onto a large branch, placing it in the center of their trap. Kyle loaded the revolver with his remaining coated bullets, his jaw set in determination. "Stay behind me. If it gets through, we run. No hesitation." Emma nodded, gripping her camera like a lifeline, though it was little more than dead weight now. Her eyes darted to the edge of the ravine where the trees loomed like sentinels. The silence stretched, every second feeling like an eternity. Then it came. The skinwalker appeared at the top of the ravine, its grotesque form silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Its body twisted and shifted, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its face an ever-changing mask of terror. It let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground. Kyle raised the revolver, aiming at the creature's chest. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. The skinwalker leaped into the ravine with shocking speed, landing just outside the circle of spikes. It hesitated, its elongated limbs twitching as if sensing the trap. Then, with a horrifying screech, it lunged forward. Kyle fired, the first bullet striking the creature in its shoulder. It let out a blood-curdling scream, but didn't stop. The second shot hit its torso, and the third landed square in its head. The skinwalker stumbled, its movements jerky and erratic, but it didn't fall. Kyle fired again, the fourth and fifth shots striking the creature in rapid succession. Finally, with a bone-rattling roar, it collapsed inside the circle of spikes, its body convulsing as the iron and tar burned its flesh. Emma clutched Kyle's arm, her voice trembling. Is it dead?" Kyle stared at the creature, its body twisted and broken, the black ichor oozing from its wounds. It wasn't moving. He lowered the revolver, his breathing ragged. "I think so." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The oppressive silence of the forest seemed to lift slightly, and the faint rustle of leaves returned. It felt as though the nightmare might finally be over. But Kyle didn't trust it. "Let's get out of here. Now." Emma nodded, and together they climbed out of the ravine, leaving the creature's smoldering body behind. They didn't look back, the weight of exhaustion and fear driving them toward what they hoped was the edge of the cursed woods. The skinwalker lay motionless in the ravine, its twisted form surrounded by the charred remains of the trap. But as the couple disappeared into the distance, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch ran through its limbs. Its work wasn't done. The forest began to thin as Emma and Kyle pressed on, their steps fueled by sheer willpower. The air grew lighter, and the oppressive silence that had weighed on them for hours was replaced by the faint sounds of wind rustling through the trees. For the first time since they had become lost, Emma felt a flicker of hope. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing ahead. Kyle squinted, his heart skipping a beat. Through the trees, the faint glow of a clearing came into view. Relief washed over him like a wave. "That has to be the trailhead," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The couple quickened their pace, the promise of escape lending strength to their exhausted bodies. When they emerged from the forest, they found themselves on a wide dirt path, the remnants of an old trailhead sign leaning against a tree. The sight of it nearly brought Emma to tears. "We made it," she said, her voice breaking. Kyle scanned the area, his revolver still in hand. Though the open space felt safer, he couldn't shake the unease that clung to him. The memory of the skinwalker's grotesque form, its resilience, and its unnatural presence lingered in his mind. He didn't dare lower his guard. "Let's keep moving," he said. "We need to get as far from here as we can." They followed the dirt path until they reached the gravel parking lot where they had left their car. The sight of it felt surreal, like a lifeline back to the world they thought they might never see again. Kyle fumbled with the keys, unlocking the car with shaking hands. Emma climbed into the passenger seat, her body sagging against the door. "We're safe now, right?" Kyle didn't answer immediately. He slid into the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the tree line one last time. Nothing moved. The forest stood silent, its shadows no longer reaching for them. "I think so," he finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. As they drove down the winding road away from the trailhead, the tension began to ease. The darkness of the forest gave way to open fields and distant lights. The nightmare they had endured felt like it was finally behind them. But deep in the forest, the skinwalker was stirring. Its body lay broken and twisted in the ravine, the black ichor that oozed from its wounds, slowly coagulating. The iron spikes still pierced its flesh, but its grotesque form began to shift, bones snapping back into place, limbs straightening. It rose on unsteady legs, its featureless face twisting into something that resembled a smile. The creature moved toward the edge of the ravine, its twisted body melting into the shadows as it climbed out. The curse of the forest demanded sustenance, and it was not yet satisfied. Back in the car, Emma glanced at Kyle, her voice hesitant. "What do we do now?" Kyle kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel. "We move on. We don't talk about it. We don't come back." Emma nodded, but neither of them noticed the faint reflection in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, something pale and featureless appeared in the back seat before vanishing into the shadows of the car. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.